Ray, as I discuss your stories with other people, I'm very often asked, where did he get the idea for that story? Let's take the Veld, for instance. Where did you get the idea for that?
Well, I learned years ago just to stand back and let ideas run over me. In other words, not try to think stories out, but to feel them out. Once you get an idea, then rush to the typewriter and get it done. And let it develop itself. Learn to trust your intuition, whatever that happens to be. We don't know what it is. It's a mystery. But if you crammed yourself with notions and poetry and concepts and scientific ideas over the years, you're bound to have a lot of mulch in there you don't know about. Plus, everything from the moment you were born, plus months before you were born that you don't really remember, all this has been put away in your head for a lifetime. And your job as a writer is to drag it out in the open, screaming and yelling. You know, you can't think it out because thinking gets in the way of the process. Intellectualizing is dangerous to the creative process. So what you do is get the smallest idea that's exciting. And you can do this by word association. I've learned to do this in my last years in high school. And the older I got, the more I did it. In the case of the Veld, I word associated one day. Went to the typewriter, just typed anything came into my head. I like to make lists of nouns and then say to yourself, okay, the night, the attic, the basement, the blue bottle, etc. And then you see what you put in the bottle or what's in the attic. In this particular case, I typed the words, the nursery, one morning. I said, nursery where? In the past? No. Present? No. What about the future? That's more interesting. What would a nursery in the future be like? So I began to think what I would want to put in it or what children would want to put in it. And I ran to the typewriter, then I just started typing, making up things to put into the nursery. And in order to talk about this nursery, I thought, what the heck, I'll have a man coming home from work one afternoon, and his wife is in the kitchen surrounded by machines, and they began to talk about the nursery, and she complains. Well, I don't know what she's complaining about, so I follow him down the hall. I'm typing like crazy here. I don't know what's going to happen. She says, the nursery is broken. Well, I don't know what's going to be in the nursery. We walk down the hall, I'm typing, open the door, and you step in, and by gosh, there's Africa, and the hot sun, the veldland, the boma trees, the lions feeding over in the heat, and this terrible smell of dust and blood. And the sun strikes me, and I'm typing like crazy. Next thing you know, the room is the villain. Africa is there. I don't know what it's doing there. And suddenly the children are mentioned. They've been playing in the room, and they've been fixating on Africa. And boom, the next thing you know, 2 hours later, the story is finished. Now, when I sat down that morning, I had no idea that I was going to be doing that short story. But obviously, I'd been thinking about Africa since I was a child. That was all put away. I fell in love with Africa to begin with when Tut was brought out of his tomb. That's when I was 3 years old. I remember seeing the pictures in the paper. 3 isn't very old, but the pictures of those gorgeous sarcophagi and the various things found in the tomb so impressed me, I never forgot it. Well, that's Northern Africa, of course. Became a super fiend for Tarzan. So that all goes into your subconscious. And all of a sudden, when you're 30, you press a button, the nursery, the Veld, boom, and all that African lore comes springing out at you as a surprise. Now, this is the only way to write that I can think of. It's got to be fun. If it isn't an adventure, if it's not a surprise, it's not going to be any good. You can't get in the way. And if you do, you become a bore, you become an intellectual writer. There's nothing worse. I can't think, there's very few intellectual writers in the history of the world who could be entertainers. The one exception is George Bernard Shaw. He's almost alone now. All the other bright people managed to fall over their own feet.
Ray, what sort of writers have influenced you over the years, or have any?
The list is endless. I probably love other writers more intensely than almost any other writer in history. I've written more short stories, more plays, more poems, more essays about other writers than any other writer I can think of. I've written poems about Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson being my mother, a poem like Emily Dickinson, Where Are You? Herman Melville called your name last night in his sleep. Did a whole thing on Hawthorne in poetry. I wrote poems about Thomas Wolfe when I was 19 and 20. Did a short story about him, which became a radio drama with Norman Corwin. And it's just endless. Herman Melville as an influence, Shakespeare as an influence. George Bernard Shaw has been a constant friend now in my life since I was 30 or so. And I knew Charles Laughton 25 years ago, and he brought a lot of these people back into my life. I used to go over to his house. He'd stand on his hearth and give performances of Lear and Othello and Hamlet just for me, you know, one person. He was that kind of man. He was a teacher of language. He was a person who put me back on my own resources. This is what Charles Laughton did for me. And he reintroduced Shakespeare into my life. I already was in love with him, but more intensely so after Laughton gave me permission to love my language again. I knew that something was wrong with me through the years. I knew I was writing a different kind of science fiction, and a lot of other science fiction writers were making fun of me because I obviously was so in love with the great poets, Shakespeare, Robert Shaw, Emily Dickinson, Yeats. Again, the list is endless. Huh? And so all these things have gone in to my background, along with the primitive things, with the African background and with King Tut and with my love of astronomy. So I've been lucky that I've fallen in love in dozens of ways, not just one way. And it's given me a richer life than some other writers have had. I am always amazed that people don't fall in love with more things. How can you not? How can you not love movies? Huh? But there are a lot of people who allow a certain kind of snobbishness to come into their lives at a certain age and look down their noses at movies, look down their noses at TV. Well, there's plenty to look down your nose at, but there's a lot of good stuff too. And I saw King Solomon's Mines again the other night on TV, and I'd seen it originally when it was in movie houses 30 years ago and loved it. And I was reminded again of how special those romances are. Films like She, films like King Kong, huh? The old radio shows, Buck Rogers, Vic and Sade, Chandu.
Well, what happened after that as far as your involvement in radio drama?
Well, I just, in high school, in junior high school and high school, when the radio shows would learn to write by listening to radio shows. Every night when Chandu went off the air, I found some of my old scripts the other day down in the basement. I would sit down and by hand transcribe the whole show. So I learned how to write 15-minute radio shows when I was 12 years old from Chandu. And when Buck Rogers came along the next year, he did the same thing. And Tarzan in 1934, I believe it was, I listened to those, Little Orphan Annie, right on up through time. And then when I was in high school, in typing class, I would type scripts for George Burns and Gracie Allen. I got to know them, hung around the studios down in Hollywood and downtown Los Angeles. At one time in 1934, there were no radio audiences for big broadcasts. And I got to know George and Gracie. And George Burns took me and a friend in to this theater in downtown LA. And the curtain went up, and my friend and I were in the front row, empty theater, two of us. And the Burns and Allen show was broadcast for the two of us that night. Huh? We were the only audience.
Let's talk for a minute about some of the themes that seem to reoccur in your stories. I look back on And the Moon Be Still as Bright, and there seems to be a theme of not changing things, leaving things as they are. This seems to also reoccur in A Sound of Thunder. Is this a conscious effort on your part?
I think it's just, you do it without knowing it. I've never noticed until later that these themes are there, and then people point them out. I say, I'll be darned, that's interesting. I think it has to do with a reverence for time and place, and I think it's inbuilt. I think it's genetic. I think I was born with a certain kind of melancholy sense for place and time, and that I respected anything like that. If I go into an old city or I go into a burial ground, there's a sense there of the ghosts of the past that I think has to be respected for whatever reasons. You don't want to get too mystical about it, but you do get an overwhelming thing. I had a really shocking, stunning experience at Normandy 5 years ago. I visited there, the American burial ground at Normandy, France, with my wife one afternoon, and we were destroyed by the experience, utterly destroyed. The weight of all those dead people was simply fantastic. Now, it's very hard to know if you bring all that with you as baggage from your knowledge of the war and our involvement in Europe over a period of 30 years or so, or whether there's something else there that says, hey, remember, huh? Here we are, remember. Don't ever forget. But it crushed us. We had to get out of there. We were in tears.
Well, that brings to mind your story, There Was an Old Woman, and your theme of encountering death and facing death, and that seems to also reoccur in Kaleidoscope.
Yeah, I think we're all working. A lot of people don't like to talk about it, but I think you have to be very honest that we're competing all the time with time. Time is running out. And I sensed this when I was very young, that I was in a competition with death. I had to get my work done. And every time I put a new short story in the mail, especially a novel, but what a triumph that is, because you really went up, huh? You say, okay, death, I've won this time. And you're not going to win forever. And as you get even older, it's even more clear that your time is running out. So I've been finishing a new novel after 10 years' work during the last few months. And I always feel I'm fighting against that thing. And just so much time is allotted to me. And I'm very privileged to have been able to live this long and write so much. But I've got a huge cargo to leave behind me, huh? And I'm so proud of that. I'm so happy that I did it. And I cannot comprehend people who don't want to leave something behind.
There's a quote on the back of some of your books by the New York Times, which calls you the world's greatest living science fiction writer. Is that how you'd like to be remembered by future generations?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I never did see that quote, and I often wondered where it came from. No, I would like to be known as a magician, and a magician of ideas, and when people spoke of me, they would speak of their favorite magician, huh? Who was able to do things that no one else could do. I could work illusions. I could make you believe. I mean, in listening to some of these radio shows that you've done, well, if you start tearing them apart, they're unbelievable. You know, really, I have situations on Mars where there's no atmosphere. Now, if you look at it scientifically, come on, dark they were in GoldenEye simply doesn't work because there's no atmosphere there, and they couldn't be running around that way. And a man couldn't build a rocket ship. But then if you relax and say, what I was doing was a metaphor, huh? And you go with a metaphor. You say, okay, this guy's building a rocket in his backyard. Can't be done, but since he's doing it, Bradbury makes me believe it. Well, I'll go with him. He's a nice guy. And you go with a metaphor finally. You say, oh, yes, yes. I wouldn't mind being a Martian myself and waking up some morning and looking in the mirror, and there are the golden eyes. And I know the change has begun, huh?
Ray, of all the books and stories and poems you've ever written, do you have a favorite?
Oh, so many, you know, but one that the older I get and the more junk comes on TV, like The Day After a couple of months ago, you know, about the atom war and the destruction of the world and all that junk, and which I refused to watch, you know, because I could see it coming. I knew it'd be big now. And we had 48 hours of talk before, then it, and 48 hours more of banal talk after. And I remembered back to my story, There Will Come Soft Rains, which told the same story, but told it in 3 pages, and it was dramatized on radio 34 years ago, and I think it took about 12 minutes, maybe 14. And it said more in 14 minutes than this big, overblown 2-hour show, because what it did was simply take all the people away and show you a house that went on talking to itself and performing and reading poetry and entertaining and lighting cigars and making dinner and cleaning the dishes and putting out the cards and watering the lawn and putting the people to sleep even though they weren't there. And finally the house burns up and the house tries to save itself, and the next morning there's nothing left of the house except one big computer panel with some tapes in it playing the poetry and reciting on and on through all the dawns to come. So the house has its own life, and the house is the metaphor for the family. And it tells you more about nuclear war, huh, in a short compact than all the big pieces of nonsense, I think.
Ray, one of the things you've been able to do very successfully is take everyday, ordinary people and place them in fantastic and sometimes futuristic settings. How did you become a science fiction writer?
I blundered into science fiction through doing it all wrong for a while. I think we all blunder into certain kinds of writing and do it wrong because we're busy imitating other people. We have heroes like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, or a lot of my science fiction friends, Robert Heinlein, and Lee Brackett, and others that I knew back when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. So you're so busy imitating them, you're doing everything wrong. At the same time, I blundered into the weird tale and began to dredge up out of my subconscious some very personal remembrance of times in my childhood And stumbled onto a short story like The Lake, which was a real incident out of the time when I was around 8 or 9. And all of a sudden, in the middle of that story, I began to cry, and I knew I was doing something good. I stumbled on something. And as time passes, you say, hey, why don't I take that personal approach that I'm using in the weird tale, things out of my past, ghosts of the past that I'm using, and apply that over in the science fiction field? Because I'm trying to do all these things like imitating John Carter or Lee Brackett, her Stark stories about Mars. And it just wasn't working, you know. You can't imitate. So I wrote a short story about 2 boys who wanted to be rocket pilots. And I think it was called The King of the Gray Spaces. And that was rejected by every magazine in the field because it just wasn't science fiction. Just a story of 2 boys who wanted to be rocket pilots. And finally appeared, I believe, in Famous Fantastic Mysteries when I was around 24. And that was the changeover. I realized then I had to write about people, not symbols of people, but real people, and put them in these fantastic situations. And then everything would be believable because these are just ordinary folks, huh?
You already mentioned some of the stories that you wrote were created from lists of words, word association stories. Did you write these just for fun, or is there really some message there you're trying to give us?
Everything's fun for me. If it isn't fun, I don't want to do it. And it may very well be that inadvertently or indirectly, I'm doing a teaching lesson, I find out later. But if the fun isn't there, then the lesson isn't worth it. Anyone that sets out to write a socially important novel is going to be a bore. I can't think of, and if you can think of one, I'd be willing to agree with you. I can't think of any socially significant novels out of the 30s written to change our minds about the world that are worth a damn today. The only novel I can think of that has a slight tinge of that is Grapes of Wrath, but that to me is a novel about a family and a man and a place and a movement. And it's only indirectly a semi-political or social tract. If Steinbeck had applied some of his earlier techniques to that novel, he would have ruined it. He was much more socially conscious a few books before that, and they don't read as well as a result. You cannot go out to cure the world.
And yet you wrote Fahrenheit 451, which was a very important social
But it was an adventure, first of all, and I fell in love with the idea of a fireman who burned books, huh? And that to me was so terrific, it was irresistible. And then once you start talking to Montag and discover he has discovered books and he wants to read them, then I say, well, heck, go read them and I'll follow. So in 9 days I wrote the novel, and it was a lark.
Are we any closer to George Orwell's concept of 1984 or your concept in Fahrenheit 451?
Well, most of us write novels to prevent futures, not predict them. So I think we're all moral writers of fables. I think Jules Verne was that way. H.G. Wells most certainly was. I think we all want to change the world, and the way to change it is to occasionally scare it and say, if you don't behave, Santa Claus isn't coming, huh? And something's going to happen to you, something terrible. So you scare people with your stories of futures you don't really believe in. You just are a little afraid of. So we're no closer to 1984 now in the United States than we ever were. We're a very healthy, self-aerating, revolutionary, truly revolutionary country.
Are you a moody person? Are there times when you just can't write?
No, I don't allow that to happen. We mustn't. You know, that is... that's self-pity of the worst sort. You mustn't allow that to happen. If these moods happen, it means something is wrong with the way you're living. Huh? They're a warning. It's like a taste for salt, and you immediately feel you're thirsty, and you go drink some fresh water, or something's missing from your diet, and you sense that there's something wrong. So you learn to stop whatever it is you're doing. That's healthy. So you go swim, you go run, you go play badminton, you get on a bicycle, whatever it is to break the mood, to get away from that stupid thing that's going on, and then try to find out why you got in the mood. You know, you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, huh? And if I were a teacher and I were moody all the time, I'd suddenly realize, number one, either I hate my students, huh, or I hate what I'm teaching. I've taught it too many years. I've got to shift. I've got to find another subject. I got to get a new kind of student. I got to take a sabbatical, whatever it is. Sit down and find out why you're so damn moody. and then do something about it in the instant, not tomorrow, not next week, something if it goes on too long. So I've learned over the years not to put up with this nonsense. And so I rarely have moods that sustain themselves. I simply will not permit, and I go do something totally different. A new piece of work will drag the old piece of work after it. And sometimes you're just tired. You've done a thing too often. I've been on this novel 10 years now. If I'm not careful, it drags me down. I don't allow that. I go do a new short story. The energy I borrow from that, I go back to the novel, and boom, everything comes to focus again. Huh? So you borrow energy. Find ways of borrowing energy. And so many new things to do. So many films you haven't seen yet. Or old films you've been promising yourself to see again. Or old radio shows you haven't heard since you were a kid. And you play those. Oh, yes, that's where I started. Huh? That's where I started. That's who I was. So all these ways of revivifying yourself.
If I could change the subject just a bit. It occurs to me you're the only person who's ever written a novel about Halloween.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There have been a few other technical books. I got curious about this about 15 years or so ago. I got to know Chuck Jones, the animator cartoonist, and loved him so much, became a very good friend of his. And we said, let's do an animated cartoon together. What shall we do? And Chuck says, well, let's do a film on Halloween. You know, you got any ideas for Halloween? Because we both had, even though we liked Peanuts and we loved Charles Schulz, we didn't like The Great Pumpkin, huh? Because the whole thing turns out to be a fraud. The Great Pumpkin never shows, you know. Because I'm sorry, you cannot do that to us. You cannot treat us children that way. Because if you tell us the Great Pumpkin is going to come, he's got to show one way or the other. So I said, I'm going to do the whole thing over and make the Great Pumpkin show up. So I said to Chuck, I've got a painting I want to show you that I'd done years before called the Halloween Tree. And I have it in my office, a huge thing. It's a big tree filled with pumpkins, and there's a body lying out under the tree made of leaves, an autumn person underneath the tree. And Chuck looked at that and said, well, he says, that's the plot for the animated film. Let's put you to work on it. And you research Halloween. Let's do an adventure, a journey into Halloween. So then I created Mr. Mounshroud and took all these kids back on a journey through death. And when I was done with it, and Chuck said, great, we'll get to work on this and do a 90-minute animated cartoon. MGM shut down its animation unit, threw us out of the studio, and we were on the streets with nowhere to go. So I says, to heck with it. I loved all the research I'd done, and I loved the story. So I wrote it into a novel, and when I was all done, I realized I had written the first novel, really, about death for children, or first real analysis of Halloween ever seriously to be undertaken. And in a way, it's an homage to Charlie Dickens. It is first cousin to The Christmas Carol. I knew when I was writing it, I was setting out to do a kind of mirror, a dark mirror reflection of The Christmas Carol. Not the same sort of story at all, but the spirit of adventure that's in Dickens to me, the young thing in him, the actor, his love of atmosphere, his love of ghosts, his love of that holiday when all the ghosts come back, and that mixture of Christmas that he knew so well.
You write about the elements. You write about fire. You write about wind. What made you write your short story called The Wind?
Again, you're always looking for things that terrify you. And you make lists of things out of your childhood. For instance, late at night, two things used to scare me. The sound of the wind, if it got too strong, winding through the screens or coming down the chimney. Or late at night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, a locomotive would run along out in the country. And I would go, ooh, and that would be the ghost of my dead cousin. I had a cousin who died and was buried out on a farm somewhere when I was 7 or 8 years old. Well, that locomotive would go by at night, and it would sound like the ghosts haunting the earth, demanding to be back, wanting to be alive again. And I'd crouch in my bed, and I'd snuggle up to my brother because I was afraid the locomotive would come get me. So that's a memory you remember, and you put it in a book like Something Wicked This Way Comes Later. And the wind, you remember that later. And then you read about those parts of the world where weather seems to be born. And you see various films having to do with weather as you grow up. And finally a day comes when you put the words "the wind" on a piece of paper and say, okay, what do I know about the wind? How can I scare myself with that?
What are the goals for the rest of your life? Is there any one thing in particular you'd care to accomplish?
Number one, finish the murder mystery I'm working on now, because I've always loved Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, and if I can even stand in their shadow, I'll be very happy. If they'll give me a little space, there's no way of predicting. I can't judge. I'm loving the book. I'm having fun with it. That doesn't mean anything. That's just my love. So we'll just wait and see when it comes out. Finishing my opera, Leviathan 99, Moby Dick in Outer Space. Want to do that. I want to do more films. I've got 100 new poems. I want more stage plays. I've got all kinds of, I've got 20 plays that have never been produced. I want to produce more of them. I've got a whole wonderful evening of the Anthem Sprinters on my life in Ireland 30 years ago. I've got a whole book on Ireland I've almost finished called Green. It's 30 of my Irish stories and essays. And, well, there's just no telling. I want to do more cartoons. I'd like to have my own comic strip someday, a Sunday comic strip like Prince Valiant. And more radio shows. You know, this year to me is one of the great years, because for 40 years or so I wanted to have my own radio series, and I begged and pleaded the network people to give me the time, and they never did. And now, all of a sudden, Brigham Young has come along, and all you nice people have come along and done this, and I'm immensely grateful. I'm very touched and very grateful. So you're giving me part of my future. And you just go on from there. You don't know what you're going to be doing. I think you have to be like Michelangelo when he was 80 and he went out and bought a big slab of marble, about a half ton. And all of his friends said, "Mickey, why are you buying that ton of marble? You're 80 years old. You'll never finish this. Get out of the way. Give me the hammer." You know, and that really is it. You know, I'm buying all kinds of tons of marble, and with luck I'm going to live into the next century and be 100 years old and continue. I want to be like George Bernard Shaw. He's my goal. He died he was around 95, and he was a scythe that had been worn down by the years. I want just a little sliver of metal to be left, yeah, when I hit 99, just enough to reap one more field.
Well, Ray, I appreciate talking with you, and I appreciate working with you. And I hope we can work on another project again sometime.